Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Al24 News, streaming live from the capital Algiers, and coming up next in our news program. Children buried under wreckage after Russian airstrike hit maternity hospital in Mariupol. Paul said that 17 people, including women in labor, were wounded in his airstrike that happened during an agreed ceasefire period to allow civilians to safely escape. Russia agreed to open humanitarian corridors in parts of Ukraine for 12 hours to allow civilians to escape from several cities, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister said in an emailed statement. Amid ongoing Russian military operation in Ukraine, in New York City, religious leaders, politicians and diplomats gathered at the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Volodymyr for an incendiary prayer service to show their support for Ukraine. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party is headed for a big election with India's most populous state of Uttar Pradesh, potentially setting the tone for the 2024 national election. Hello again and welcome. Those were today's headlines. Starting our news with the latest over the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Ukrainian counterpart Dmitry Kuleba have had face-to-face talks in Antalya, Turkey. Ukraine says it has opened 7 humanitarian corridors, though which civilians can evacuate to safety. UNICEF says dozens of children have been killed amid Moscow's offensive. Ukraine has accused Russia of bombing a children's hospital at maternity area in the besieged port city, trapping children and others under the wreckage in what it called a war crime without justification. Zara Farjani on what follow.
Authorities in Ukraine have accused Russian forces of dropping bombs on a maternity hospital in the city of Mariupol. The ground shook more than a mile away when the Mariupol complex was hit by the series of blasts that blew out windows and ripped away much of the front of one building. Ukrainian police and soldiers rushed to the scene to evacuate victims.
It was an airstrike near the maternity hospital. At the moment, we continue to help the wounded and preparing to evacuate them. Police are working together with the army to help those who need it.
The attack came despite Russia agreeing to a 12-hour ceasefire to allow refugees to evacuate a number of towns and cities.
Today, Russian invaders committed a grave crime. They carried out an airstrike on the city center of Mariupol. They destroyed by bombing the maternity hospital. Women and children were wounded. It is a war crime without any justification.
President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on Twitter that there were people, children, under the wreckage and called the strike an atrocity. In a televised video later on, Zelensky addressed the Europeans, asking them to toughen the sanctions on Russia.
You have to toughen the sanctions against Russia to put an end to this genocide. You have to pressure Russia to sit at the table of negotiations and halt this bestial war.
The Donetsk region's governor said 17 people were wounded in the attack, including women and labor. The reports could not immediately be verified. The United Nations human rights body said it was verifying the number of casualties at Mariupol.
Following the Russian airstrike against the maternity hospital in Mariupol city, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky described the attack as proof that genocide of Ukrainians is taking place. Let's have a listen.
A children's hospital, a maternity hospital, how did they threaten the Russian Federation? What kind of country is the Russian Federation? A country afraid of maternity hospitals and destroying them. The airstrike on the maternity hospital is the ultimate proof that the genocide of Ukrainians is taking place. Europeans, you cannot say that you have not seen what is happening to Ukrainians. To Mariupol, to the inhabitants of Mariupol, you saw, you know.
Відбувалося у Маріуполі з маріупольцями. Ви бачили, ви знаєте.
During a joint news conference in Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, alongside his British counterpart Liz Truss, said that they want to avoid a direct military confrontation with Russia, not to expand it with both sides. The United States and the United Kingdom have echoed their opposition to establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
But the reality is that setting up a no-fly zone would lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. And that is not what we are looking at. What we are looking at is making sure that the Ukrainians are able to defend their own country with the best possible selection of anti-tank weapons and anti-air defense systems.
We're also united in calling on the Kremlin to immediately allow Ukrainian civilians to safely depart the cities and towns of Ukraine that are besieged by Russian forces. Every country has a responsibility to join us in pressing Moscow to do this. This is not the time to equivocate by calling on both sides to allow civilians in Ukraine's cities to leave safely. Doing so obfuscates the basic facts around why these corridors are necessary and who is blocking them.
Russia said on Thursday Ukrainian claims that it bombed a children's hospital in Mariupol was fake news, stating that the building was a former maternity hospital that had no longer been taken by the troops. Zelensky said that Russia has warned on March 7th that the hospital had been turned into a military object from which Ukrainians were firing. After the international fear and Ukrainian accusation of Russia of shelling the Ukrainian nuclear power plant Chernobyl, Russia has accused Ukrainian forces of targeting the Chernobyl infrastructure. Russia denied Ukrainian claims of targeting the nuclear power plant and insisting that the Ukrainian forces did so. Russian ambassador to the U.S. Anthony Antonov said in response to mass media questions that the U.S. administration shows by a statement that they are highly concerned of disclosed truth about the military biological program near Russian borders.
Such nervous statements by the U.S. authorities indicate the serious concern of the White House about the revelation of the truth about the ongoing work of the military biological program near the borders of the Russian Federation funded by the USA.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is greeted by his Turkish counterpart Mevlut Cavusoglu in Turkey ahead of their talks with their Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Kuleba in the first such meeting since Russia started a military operation in Ukraine on February 24th.
I did my best to at least find a diplomatic solution to the humanitarian tragedy unfolding on the battleground and in the besieged cities.
There is nothing to replace negotiation process between the two sides. We have confirmed on a daily basis that our proposal for the opening of humanitarian corridors is still valid.
Dmitry Kuleba accused Russia of breaking ceasefire accords and bombarding humanitarian corridors from Zaporizhzhia to Mariupol, where Russia, on the other hand, promised to provide humanitarian corridors in Ukraine to allow citizens caught up in war zones to evacuate. Kiev is not convinced and called the move a publicity stunt. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov said that during the operation, Russia's armed forces have attacked 2,203 Ukrainian military infrastructure targets were hit. Among them are 76 command points and communication hubs of Ukraine's armed forces, 111 S-300 BAK-M1 and OSA air defense weapon systems, as well as 71 radar stations. Some 69 planes were eliminated on the ground and 24 aircraft in the air, as well as 778 tanks and other armored combat vehicles, 77 multiple launch rocket systems, 279 weaponry guns and blasters, 553 military vehicles and 62 drones. The House passed a $13.6 billion in aid for Ukraine and Eastern European countries, while $15.6 billion for response to COVID-19 fell by the wayside as Democrats work to pass the legislation, which now has two Senates and the result of months of bipartisan negotiation between Democrats and Republicans. Majority of U.S. House of Representatives voted to impose a ban on imports of Russian oil and other energy products in retaliation for Moscow's ongoing special operation in Ukraine. With the vote still underway, the Democratic-controlled House passed the bill after President Joe Biden on Tuesday used his executive powers to impose such a ban. The International Monetary Fund has approved $1.4 billion in emergency financing for Ukraine amid the ongoing military operation of Russia in Ukraine. The Executive Board of International Monetary Fund approved $1.4 billion under the rapid financing instruments to help meet urgent financing needs and ease the economic impacts of the special operation. The European Union decided Wednesday to disapprove 146 members of Russia's upper chamber of parliament, as well as 14 Kremlin-connected billionaires and family in response to Moscow's operation in Ukraine. Officials said so far EU sanctions have targeted hundreds of members of Russia's lower house, the Duma, who supported Russia's recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. President Joe Biden has prohibited Russian oil and gas imports into the United States, while the UK government has announced plans to phase out Russian oil imports by the end of the year. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is also scheduled to make a statement later this week on lowering British purchase of Russian gas.
With the plan we outlined today, the EU can end its dependence on Russian gas and repower Europe. Fit for 55, once implemented, will reduce the EU's total gas consumption by 30% by 2030. That is 100 billion cubic meters of gas we will no longer need.
As we go forward, and even though it's incredibly difficult for some European countries, including colleagues of the Visegrad Four today, everybody can see that we now need to do that. And then there was an agreement also on the need to show the people of Ukraine now that whatever happens, once a free, sovereign, independent Ukraine is protected and restored, we will rebuild. And we will have a plan, a Marshall Plan, to rebuild Ukraine.
Soaring energy and food prices triggered by Russia's military operation in Ukraine could worsen food security concerns in the Middle East and Africa and may fuel growing social unrest. And as the World Bank chief economist Reinhardt says, adding there will be important difficulties for the Middle East, for Africa, North Africa and the Sub-Saharan African in particular, which had already been experiencing food insecurity. It is worth mentioning that Germany will host a virtual meeting of agriculture ministers from the group of 7 advanced economies on Friday to discuss the impacts of this military operation amid growing concerns about stabilizing food markets. Pakistan has slammed the European Union for what it sees as violations of diplomatic norms by pressuring Islamabad to condemn Russia's recent military operation in Ukraine. The commotion has underscored perceptions that Islamabad is allying with Russia and China over the US and the West in what some see as fast-emerging new Cold War. It was lost on a few observers that Prime Minister Imran Khan went ahead with a planned 2-day visit to Moscow just as Russia was launching its cross-border assault on Ukraine, which has since triggered massive Western sanctions against Russia. Venezuela released 2 jailed U.S. citizens in an apparent goodwill gesture toward the Biden administration following a visit to Caracas by a high-level U.S. delegation.
The White House announced Tuesday night that the Venezuelan government has freed 2 jailed Americans, including an oil executive imprisoned alongside colleagues for more than 4 years.
And I have to say, I'm very pleased that diplomacy brought 2 unjustly detained Americans home just last night. We will never let up anywhere, at any time, in the efforts to bring Americans who are unjustly detained back home.
The release of Gustavo Cardenas and Jorge Alberto Fernandez came hours after Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro signaled an interest in improving relations at a time when Russia-Ukraine conflict has sparked concerns in the United States over rising gas prices.
Tremendo, como saben ustedes.
We're going to an immediate reformation and revitalization of the process of international political dialogue, as I announced, for the meeting of all sectors, for the peace of Venezuela, for the recovery of Venezuela.
The weekend visit by the U.S. delegation to Venezuela focused not only on the fate of detained Americans, but on the possibility of easing U.S. oil sanctions on the OPEC member to fill a supply gap if Biden banned Russian oil imports in response to Moscow's military operation in Ukraine, while Venezuela is Russia's closest ally in South America. The freeing of the 2 prisoners could set a more positive tone for talks between the United States and Venezuela, which have had hostile relations through successive American administrations.
People of many faiths has attended a prayer service for Ukraine in New York City on Wednesday morning. Many citizens showed their support for the Ukrainian people amid the rising conflict on the territories that took several lives, as prayers condemned what they named an attack on Ukrainian sovereignty, as they called for peace in the region, which has become a conflict zone.
All Ukrainians and I guess many people in such pain.
I'm actually a Buddhist, but I'm here just to please pray.
We're not only praying, but we're putting our prayers in action. I would like to ask people of Russian Federation, please do everything possible to stop the slaughter of innocent people.
The much-awaited day for the UP Assembly election results in India has come as the counting of votes, a notable result of success that several exit polls have predicted. Yogi Adityanath BJP government in Uttar Pradesh had overwhelming majority in the primary results of the poll.
Priest Yogi Adityanath of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu Nationalist Party won regional elections Thursday in Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state. The Bharatiya Janata Party seemed to win a comfortable majority, although in decline, the elections in Uttar Pradesh constituted a success for Modi. The party was keen to maintain its influence of this key state of more than 200 million inhabitants to consolidate its position in the run-up to the national elections in 2024. The northern state is a trophy in these elections, which have taken place in 5 regions in recent weeks. Uttar Pradesh sends most deputies to the national parliament, traditionally representing the power base of most Indian prime ministers. Yogi Adityanath has been a regular source of controversy since his surprise appointment in 2017 as chief executive of Uttar Pradesh, one of the poorest states in the world. For the past 5 years, Yogi has displayed himself in darker shade of saffron, which is the color of Hinduism, than Modi. His Hindu supremacist speeches and his image as a relentless leader have skyrocketed his popularity far beyond the borders of his state. The Bharatiya Janata Party would also have retained power in the states of Uttarakhand, Manipur and Goa, although the race is tied there. The Congress Party appeared to be losing northern Punjab to the left-wing AAP, also ruling Delhi state, a fatal blow to the formation of the once powerful Gandhi dynasty.
Opposition People's Power Party candidate Yoon Suk-yeol won the presidency of South Korea in 20th presidential election. With 100% of the votes counted, Yoon this latter received 14.8 million votes, which means 84% of the vote. Hussein Burkan has more to clarify this vote election.
Conservative Yoon Suk-yeol, a former prosecutor new to politics, was elected president of South Korea, narrowly defeating the candidate of the center-left ruling party and promising to pursue a more aggressive policy towards North Korea. Mr. Yoon, the candidate of People's Power Party, won with 48.56% of vote against 47.83% for his Democratic Party rival Lee Jae-myung.
This is the victory of the great South Korea people. During the election, I learned a lot about what it takes to become the leader the country needs and how to listen to people. The rivalry is now over. Now we must come together in order to serve our country and our people.
In another speech, Yoon promised that he will defend democracy and firmly uphold the principles of the rule of law.
Filled with emotion and sense of boundless responsibility, I stand before our fellow Korean citizens as the 20th elected president, whichever side you belong to. We will vigorously rid ourselves of any corruption that threatens democracy and firmly uphold the principle of the rule of law applied equally to all Koreans.
Mr. Yoon, who takes office in May, will soon face an increasingly aggressive North Korean regime, which began a record series of test fringes in January, including 1 day before the elections.
Russian military operation in Ukraine has resulted in Europe's most refugee crisis in decades, with over 2 million Ukrainians fleeing the nation in less than 2 weeks. The UN says that as 8th of March, Poland has taken 1,294,903 refugees, Hungary 203,222, Slovakia 153,303, Russia 99,300, Romania 85,444, Moldova 82,762, Belarus 592, and more than 235,000 people have gone to other countries. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. But before the end, let's have a reminder for our main top stories. Children buried under wreckage after Russian airstrike hit maternity hospital in Mariupol. Reports said 70 people, including women in labor, were wounded in this airstrike that happened during an agreed ceasefire period to allow civilians to safely escape. Russia agreed to open humanitarian corridors in ports of Ukraine for 12 hours to allow civilians to escape from several cities, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister said in an email statement. Amid ongoing Russian military operation in Ukraine, in New York City, religious leaders, politicians and diplomats gathered at the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Vladimir for an intercessory prayer service to show their support for Ukraine. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party is headed for a big election win in India's most populous state of Uttar Pradesh, potentially setting the tone for 2024 national election. That's all the news we have got for now. Peace. Bye-bye.